The bullet wasn't meant for her, but the noose would be. When Mei Lin Zhao pulled the trigger that dusty evening in Cottonwood Springs, she sealed her fate in a town that had been waiting for an excuse to destroy her. A Chinese woman, an outsider, a killer, they'd say, though none of them saw what really happened in that room. Now every man with a gun wants her dead, and the law won't save her. But one cowboy might. If you want to know whether justice can survive in a place built on lies, stay until the end. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Here's what happened the night everything changed. The shot echoed through Cottonwood Springs like a church bell at midnight. Wrong, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. Mei Lin Zhao stood in the center of Samuel Thornton's private study, the revolver still warm in her shaking hands, smoke curling from the barrel in lazy spirals that seemed to mock the stillness of the moment. The oil lamp on the desk flickered, casting shadows that danced across Thornton's body where it had fallen. One arm draped over the Persian rug he'd imported from back east, the other clutched against his chest where the blood was already spreading dark and thick. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room smelled of gunpowder and expensive tobacco, and something copper-sharp that made her stomach twist. What have I done? But she knew what she'd done. She'd survived. That's what she'd done. The problem was convincing anyone else of that. Through the study window, she could already hear voices rising from the street below, sharp, urgent, angry. Thornton's house sat on the hill overlooking Main Street, a monument to his wealth and influence, and sound carried in this godforsaken town like wind through a canyon. Someone had heard the shot. Of course they had. In 15 seconds, maybe 20, someone would come through that door, and when they did, they'd see a Chinese woman standing over the body of the richest, most powerful man in 3 counties. They wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't care about the truth. Mei Lin dropped the gun like it had burned her. It hit the hardwood floor with a clatter that seemed obscenely loud in the heavy silence. Her hands were shaking so badly, she had to clasp them together to make them stop. But that didn't help. Nothing helped, because the shaking was inside her now, in her bones, in her blood. She'd come to America 3 years ago with nothing but hope and a willingness to work herself raw for a chance at something better. She'd scrubbed floors, washed linens, cooked meals in kitchens where the other help wouldn't look at her, wouldn't speak to her except to give orders. She'd kept her head down. She'd stayed quiet. She'd survived in the margins the way her mother had taught her, be useful, be invisible, and maybe they'll let you live. But Samuel Thornton had noticed her anyway. At first, it had seemed like opportunity. He'd hired her directly to manage his household, paid her more than she'd ever seen, gave her a small room in the servants' quarters that was hers and hers alone. She'd been grateful. Stupid, maybe, but grateful. She hadn't understood what the price would be. The first time he'd cornered her in the pantry, she'd pushed him away, stammered an apology, tried to pretend she'd misunderstood. The second time, she'd been more firm, more clear, and he'd laughed like she'd told a joke. The third time was tonight. He'd called her into his study under the pretense of discussing household expenses. She'd known it was a lie the moment she'd walked in and seen the whiskey on his desk, the way his collar was already loosened, the look in his eyes that made her skin crawl. But she'd gone anyway because refusing Mr. Thornton wasn't something you did in Cottonwood Springs. Not if you wanted to keep your job, not if you wanted to keep breathing. Close the door, Mei Lin, he'd said, and his voice had been smooth, controlled, the voice of a man who'd never been told no in his entire privileged life. She'd closed the door. And then he'd stood up, walked around the desk, and put his hands on her. The rest had happened so fast it felt like a blur even now, standing here with his blood soaking into the rug. She'd tried to push him away. He'd grabbed her wrist, twisted it until pain shot up her arm. She'd cried out, tried to pull free, and he'd slapped her hard enough to split her lip. Then his hands were on her dress, tearing at the buttons, and something inside her had broken. Not fear anymore, but fury, pure and bright and desperate. She'd seen the gun in the drawer. He kept it there. Everyone knew that. Kept it loaded. She'd grabbed for it. He'd tried to stop her. They'd struggled. And then the gun had gone off. Now he was dead, and she was standing here like an idiot, waiting for the rope. The voices outside were getting louder, boots on the wooden porch stairs, someone shouting Thornton's name. The front door banging open. Mei Lin turned and ran. She flew through the study door into the hallway, her worn shoes slipping on the polished floor. The house was a maze of rooms and corridors she'd cleaned 100 times, but which now felt alien and hostile in the lamplight. Behind her, she could hear men's voices echoing through the foyer, calling for Thornton, demanding to know what had happened. "Upstairs!" someone shouted. The shot came from upstairs. She hit the servants' staircase at the back of the house and took the steps 2 at a time, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. At the bottom was a narrow hallway that led to the kitchen, and beyond that, the back door. If she could just reach it, if she could get outside before they sealed off the house. The kitchen was dark. She crossed it in blind panic, hands outstretched, knocking into the heavy work table hard enough to bruise her hip. The back door was just ahead. She could see the outline of it in the moonlight filtering through the window. She grabbed the handle. Locked. No, 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 no. Her fingers fumbled with the bolt, slick with sweat, shaking too hard to grip properly. Behind her, the voices were getting closer. Footsteps thundering down the main staircase, someone calling for the sheriff. The bolt finally slid free. Mei-Lin yanked the door open and stumbled out into the night. The air hit her like a slap, cold, sharp, carrying the smell of dust and horses and the faint sour tang of the stockyards at the edge of town. She ran across the backyard, past the carriage house and the empty stable, toward the narrow alley that separated Thornton's property from the neighboring estate. Her lungs burned. Her dress caught on something, a fence post, a loose nail, and she heard fabric tear but didn't stop, couldn't stop. Behind her, the back door banged open again. There, someone's running! After them! Gunfire cracked through the night. One shot, then another. The second one hit the fence post inches from her head, sending splinters flying. Mei-Lin ducked, veered left, and threw herself into the alley's shadows. The alley was narrow and choked with refuse. Broken crates, empty barrels, things she couldn't see in the dark that crunched under her feet or caught at her skirts. She ran anyway, blind with terror, following the thin strip of open sky above her head. The alley spilled out onto a side street she didn't recognize, all darkened storefronts and shuttered windows. No help here. No safety. More shouts behind her, closer now. They were organizing, spreading out. In a town this small, there was nowhere to hide for long. She turned right, then left, trying to lose them in the warren of back streets that made up Cottonwood Springs after dark. Her breath came in ragged gasps that scraped her throat raw. Her side ached. She'd lost a shoe somewhere, and the ground was rough with stones and broken glass, but she couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop, because if they caught her, when they caught her, the thought died as she rounded a corner and nearly ran straight into a group of men gathered outside the saloon. They turned at the sound of her footsteps, faces shadowed under hat brims, and for a frozen second, nobody moved. Then one of them pointed. "That's her! That's Thornton's girl!" Mei-Lin spun and ran the other direction, back the way she'd come. But there were more men there now, too, pouring out of the buildings like ants from a disturbed hill. The whole damn town was awake. The whole damn town was after her. "She killed him!" someone screamed. "She killed Mr. Thornton! Get the sheriff! Forget the sheriff! String her up!" The world tilted sideways, became a nightmare of flickering torchlight and reaching hands and voices that wanted her blood. Mei-Lin dodged between two buildings, squeezed through a gap barely wide enough for her shoulders, came out in someone's backyard where laundry hung ghostly in the moonlight. A dog barked furiously, lunging against its chain. She vaulted a low fence, landed badly, felt something twist in her ankle, but kept moving because stopping meant dying. The streets were a maze. Every turn brought more voices, more lights, more men with guns and ropes and murder in their eyes. She could hear the sheriff's voice now, trying to organize them, trying to impose some kind of order on the mob. But it was like trying to hold back a flood with your bare hands. "Fan out! She can't have gone far! Check the stables! Watch the roads out of town!" Mei-Lin's vision was starting to blur at the edges, her body screaming for rest, but she pushed on through sheer animal terror. The stable, they'd said check the stables, which meant maybe the stables weren't checked yet. Maybe she could hide there. Maybe... The livery was at the end of Main Street, a large wooden structure that smelled of hay and horse and old leather. The big doors stood partly open, darkness yawning inside. Mei-Lin glanced behind her, no one in immediate pursuit, but she could see torches bobbing in the distance, hear the voices calling to each other, and made a decision. She slipped through the gap in the doors and pressed herself against the wall inside, trying to breathe quietly despite the fact that her lungs felt like they were on fire. The stable was dark and close, illuminated only by thin strips of moonlight that slanted through gaps in the walls. Horses shifted in their stalls, disturbed by her entrance. Somewhere in the loft above, a barn cat mewed softly. The smell of hay was overwhelming, thick and dusty and oddly comforting in its familiarity. She couldn't stay here. She knew that. They'd search the stable eventually, and when they did, they'd find her. And then her hand went to her torn dress, to the bruises already forming on her wrist where Thornton had grabbed her. Evidence. Proof. But proof of what? That she'd fought back? That she'd refused to lie down and accept what he'd tried to take? In this town, to these people, that wouldn't matter. All they'd see was a dead white man and a living Chinese woman. The math was simple. The verdict was already decided. She should run, keep moving, head for the edge of town and take her chances in the open desert. But her ankle was throbbing now, swelling inside her remaining shoe, and she was so tired, so desperately tired, and the darkness of the stable was seductive in its temporary safety. Just a minute, just long enough to catch her breath. Mei Lin moved deeper into the building, past the occupied stalls toward the back, where spare tack hung on the walls and old saddles gathered dust. There was a space behind a stack of hay bales where the shadows were deepest. She wedged herself into it, pulled her knees to her chest, and tried to make herself as small as possible. Outside, the voices continued to echo through the streets of Cottonwood Springs. Find her. She's got to be hiding somewhere. When we catch her, we'll make an example. Mei Lin closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against her knees, trying not to sob, trying not to scream, trying not to think about the fact that she was going to die here. In this place she'd never wanted to be, among people who'd never seen her as anything but an outsider, a threat, something less than human. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Be smart, be quiet, survive. But there was no surviving this. The stable doors creaked open wider, spilling torchlight across the floor. Anyone in here? A gruff voice called out. Mei Lin's heart stopped. Footsteps crunched on the straw-covered floor, heavy boots, moving slowly, methodically, checking each stall. The horses whinnied nervously. The footsteps came closer. She pressed herself further back into the shadows, barely breathing, every muscle locked tight. Through a gap in the hay bales, she could see the orange glow of the torch moving along the aisle between the stalls. Nothing up front, another voice said. Check the back. The torchlight swung in her direction. This was it. This was where it ended. In a stable, cornered like an animal, with nowhere left to run. She thought about reaching for something, a piece of tack, a broken board, anything she could use as a weapon. But what was the point? She couldn't fight a whole town. She couldn't even fight one man without it ending in death. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the hay bales. Mei Lin held her breath and waited for the end. Caleb Rourke had been nursing the same whiskey for the better part of an hour when the first shot rang out. He was sitting at his usual corner table in the Last Dollar saloon, hat pulled low, trying to ignore the noise and the smoke and the general stupidity that filled the place every Saturday night. The whiskey was rot gut, barely fit for cleaning wounds, but it was cheap, and it did the job if you drank enough of it. Not that Caleb was trying to get drunk. He was just trying to get through another evening in Cottonwood Springs without doing something he'd regret. The shot changed all that. The saloon went quiet for about 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to register the sound, long enough for the drunker patrons to wonder if they'd imagined it, and then someone threw open the doors and shouted that Thornton had been killed. After that, it was chaos. Men poured into the street like the building was on fire. Caleb watched them go, taking another slow sip of his whiskey. Samuel Thornton was dead. Well, the world would keep spinning. He'd never liked Thornton much. The man had been a bully with money, the kind who thought owning land and buying people gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. Caleb had worked for him once, years back, and it had lasted exactly 3 weeks before he told Thornton where he could shove his job and his money both. Still, murder was murder, even when the victim deserved worse. He was reaching for his glass when Harlan Pike, one of Thornton's foremen, a thick-necked bastard who enjoyed his authority a little too much, came back through the saloon doors, breathing hard. "It was that Chinese girl," Pike announced to the half-empty room. "Thornton's housekeeper shot him dead in his own study." A murmur ran through the remaining drinkers, part shock, part something uglier. Caleb set his glass down carefully. Anyone actually see it happen? He asked. Pike swung toward him, face flushed. Don't need to see it, Rourke. She was the only one in the house with him. She ran. That's all the proof anyone needs. That's not proof of murder, Caleb said quietly. That's proof of running. Same difference with her kind. Pike spat on the floor. Sheriff's organizing a search. We're going to find her and make sure justice gets done. Caleb doubted very much that what Pike had in mind qualified as justice, but he kept that thought to himself. He'd learned a long time ago that arguing with drunk, angry men was a good way to get yourself killed. Pike left again, and the saloon slowly emptied as men decided that hunting a woman through the streets sounded more entertaining than drinking. Caleb stayed where he was, turning his glass in slow circles on the scarred table, thinking. He didn't know Thornton's housekeeper. Had seen her once or twice around town, always with her head down, always moving quick like she didn't want to be noticed. Small woman, quiet. The kind who did her work and kept to herself. The kind Thornton would have seen as easy prey. Caleb drained the last of his whiskey and stood up. The bartender glanced over, surprised. You joining the hunt, Rourke? Something like that, Caleb said, and walked out into the night. Main Street was lit up like Christmas, torches bobbing in the darkness as groups of men spread out through town. Caleb could hear the sheriff trying to maintain some kind of order, but it was a losing battle. This was a mob now, not a search party. They weren't looking for justice, they were looking for blood. He moved through the chaos like a ghost, keeping to the shadows, listening. Someone said they'd seen her running toward the south end of town. Someone else swore she'd been heading for the stockyards. A third voice claimed she'd doubled back toward the church. Nobody actually knew anything, but that wasn't stopping them from being certain. Caleb worked his way toward the livery. It was the smart place to hide if you were cornered and desperate. Lots of shadows, lots of places to disappear, and if you were lucky, access to a horse. He'd hidden there himself once, years ago, when a card game had gone bad and he'd needed to make himself scarce for a while. The big doors stood open. Torchlight flickered inside. Voices. Caleb circled around to the side entrance, moving quiet. Through a gap in the boards, he could see two men searching the stalls, methodical and thorough. And behind them, wedged into the shadows behind a stack of hay bales, he saw her. She was small, compact, dressed in what had probably been a decent work dress before it got torn half to pieces. Even from here, he could see she was shaking, terrified, trapped. The men were getting closer to her hiding spot. Caleb made a decision he'd probably regret. He pushed open the side door and stepped inside, loud enough to draw attention. The two men spun around, hands going to their guns. "Rourke?" one of them said, relaxing slightly. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you, looking for the girl." Caleb glanced around the stable with deliberate casualness. "Any luck?" "Not yet, but we're checking everywhere." "Good. Sheriff wants everyone to report back in 10 minutes, says he's got a new lead." It was a complete lie, but the men bought it. They exchanged glances, nodded, and headed for the front doors, taking their torch with them. "We'll check the stockyards next," one called back. "You coming?" "In a minute," Caleb said. "Gonna look around a bit more first." The doors swung shut behind them. Darkness and silence rushed back in, broken only by the quiet sounds of horses breathing and hooves shifting in straw. Caleb waited a 3 count, then said quietly, "They're gone. You can come out now." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the woman emerged from behind the hay bales, moving like a beaten dog that expects another kick. In the dim light slanting through the walls, he could see her face. Young, maybe mid-20s, with dark eyes that were wide with fear and suspicion. Blood trickled from a split lip. Bruises were already forming on her jaw. "Who are you?" she asked, and her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Name's Caleb Rourke, and unless you want to hang before sunrise, you need to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." She stared at him, trembling, clearly trying to decide if he was another threat or possibly, impossibly, something else. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would you help me?" It was a good question. Caleb wasn't entirely sure he had a good answer. "Because I know what it's like when nobody listens to your side of the story," he said. "And because I knew Samuel Thornton. Whatever happened between you two, I'm betting you didn't start it." Her eyes filled with tears, not weakness, but rage and relief and exhaustion all mixed together. He tried to... I didn't mean to. It was an accident. Save it, Caleb said, not unkindly. Right now, the truth doesn't matter. What matters is getting you out of this town alive. After that, we can worry about the rest. They'll kill you too, she said. For helping me. Maybe, but I've been looking for a good reason to leave Cottonwood Springs anyway. He held out his hand. So what do you say? You want to live through tonight? Mei Lin Zhao looked at his outstretched hand like it was a miracle she didn't quite believe in. Then slowly, she reached out and took it. What's your name? Caleb asked. Mei Lin. All right, Mei Lin, here's what we're going to do. The plan was simple because simple plans were the only ones that worked when everything was already going to hell. Caleb saddled his horse, a rangy gray gelding named Smoke, who'd carried him through worse situations than this, and helped Mei Lin up behind him. She was light, barely there, and she held on to him with a grip that spoke of absolute desperation. When we leave, Caleb said, keeping his voice low, we're going straight through the middle of town. No sneaking. They see us sneaking, they'll know something's wrong. We ride like we've got every right to be here, and with any luck, they'll be too busy searching buildings to pay attention. And if they do pay attention, then we ride fast and hope Smoke's got one more miracle left in him. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. Caleb led the horse to the front doors, took a breath, and mounted up. Mei Lin's arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back. He could feel her shaking. Hold on, he said, and nudged Smoke into a walk. They emerged from the stable into the torchlit chaos of Main Street. Men were everywhere, searching buildings, calling to each other, arguing about which direction she'd gone. The sheriff was trying to organize a perimeter. Someone was shouting about checking the church basement. Nobody looked at them. Caleb kept Smoke at an easy walk, heading straight down the center of the street like they had every right to be there. His heart was hammering, but he kept his face neutral, bored even, just another cowboy heading home after a night in town. They were halfway to the edge of town when someone finally noticed. Hey, Rourke, where are you going? Caleb turned in the saddle, casual as Sunday. It was Jake Morrison, one of the ranch hands from the Double T spread. Home. Got early work tomorrow. You see anything suspicious? That Chinese girl's around here somewhere. Haven't seen her, Caleb said truthfully. Good luck with the search. Morrison nodded and turned away. Behind Caleb's back, Mei Lin had gone absolutely rigid, not even breathing. They were maybe 20 yards from the last building, from open ground, from... Wait a minute. Caleb's hand moved to the gun on his hip, smooth and instinctive. Morrison was looking at them again, his eyes narrowing. That's not your usual route home, Rourke, and is that... Caleb didn't give him time to finish the thought. He dug his heels into Smoke's flanks, and the horse lunged forward into a gallop. Behind them, Morrison's shout split the night. He's got her! Rourke's got the girl! Then it was just speed and chaos and the thundering of hooves on hard-packed dirt. Gunfire cracked behind them. 1 shot, 2, 3. But Caleb was already leaning low over Smoke's neck, and Mei Lin had buried her face against his back, and the gelding was running like his life depended on it, because it probably did. The edge of town flashed past. Open desert spread before them, dark and vast under the moon. More gunfire, more shouting, but it was falling away now, getting dimmer because Smoke was fast and they had a head start, and a bullet whipped past Caleb's ear close enough that he felt the displaced air. Stay low, he shouted to Mei Lin and urged Smoke to go faster. The desert swallowed them whole, darkness and sagebrush and distant mountains like broken teeth against the stars. Behind them, Cottonwood Springs was a scatter of lights and angry voices already fading into the night. Ahead was nothing but wilderness and uncertainty and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they could outrun what was coming. Caleb didn't look back. Neither did Mei Lin. They just rode, 2 fugitives disappearing into the vast American darkness, leaving behind a town that wanted them dead and carrying with them a truth that nobody had bothered to ask about. The night swallowed their hoofbeats. The desert kept their secrets. And somewhere behind them, the hunt was just beginning. They rode hard for the first hour, pushing Smoke to the edge of what the horse could handle. The desert stretched out around them in shades of gray and black, the moon providing just enough light to see the roughest terrain, but not enough to avoid everything. Twice the gelding stumbled on loose rock, and Caleb felt Mei Lin's grip tighten around his waist, until her fingers dug into his ribs. She didn't make a sound, though, didn't complain, just held on. When they finally slowed to a walk, Both of them were breathing hard. Caleb's shoulder ached where he'd wrenched it, pulling smoke around a boulder he'd spotted too late. Behind them, there was nothing but darkness and silence. No torches, no sounds of pursuit. Either they'd lost the posse, or the men from Cottonwood Springs were regrouping, planning a more organized hunt come daylight. Caleb was betting on the latter. "You can let go now," he said quietly. "We're safe for the moment." Maylin's arms loosened but didn't release completely. "Where are we going?" "North. There's a canyon about 10 miles from here with water and cover. We can rest there, let Smoke recover. After that—" He trailed off because he didn't have a good answer for after that. "We'll figure it out. They'll come after us." "Yes." "They'll kill you for helping me." "Probably," Caleb agreed. "You already said that back in the stable. I helped you anyway." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Why?" It was the second time she'd asked. Caleb still didn't have a better answer than before. "Because somebody needed to," he said finally, "and I was there. That's not a reason. It's the only one I've got." The canyon appeared as the sky began to lighten in the east, a jagged crack in the earth that dropped away into shadows and the sound of running water. Caleb guided Smoke down a narrow trail that switchbacked along the canyon wall, careful and slow. One wrong step, and they'd all go tumbling into the rocks below. At the bottom, a thin stream cut through the canyon floor, fed by a spring somewhere up in the rocks. Cottonwoods grew along the banks, their leaves whispering in the pre-dawn breeze. It wasn't much, but it was cover, and it was water, and that was more than they'd had an hour ago. Caleb dismounted and helped Maylin down. She nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground, her injured ankle giving out. He caught her before she fell. "Easy," he said. "When did you hurt that?" "Running." "I don't know. It doesn't matter." "It matters if you can't walk." He guided her to a flat rock near the stream and made her sit. Her ankle was swollen, already turning purple. Not broken, he didn't think, but badly sprained. She wasn't going to be running anywhere for a while. Caleb led Smoke to the water and let the horse drink while he pulled off the saddle and blanket. The gelding's coat was dark with sweat despite the cool night air. He'd earned every bit of rest they could give him. "We'll stay here until full dark tonight," Caleb said, walking back to where Maylin sat. "Give Smoke time to recover. Give us time to think. They'll track us. Maybe. But tracks are harder to follow in daylight when you've got a lot of ground to cover, and they don't know which direction we went. Could be north, could be east, could be west. They'll have to split up to search, and that works in our favor." Maylin looked at him with those dark, exhausted eyes. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "Long time ago. Different circumstances." "What happened?" "I got away. Eventually." He pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and offered it to her. "Drink. You're shaking." She took the canteen with both hands, her fingers trembling so badly she almost dropped it. When she drank, it was in small, careful sips, like she was trying to make it last even though there was a whole stream 3 feet away. Caleb watched her in the growing light. Up close, she looked even worse than he'd thought. The split lip, the bruising on her jaw, the torn dress that exposed scratches on her shoulder and collarbone. And her eyes. There was something raw in them, something that went deeper than fear. "What happened tonight?" he asked. "In Thornton's house?" Maylin lowered the canteen and stared at the water for a long time. "You don't believe I killed him?" "I believe you shot him. Whether you killed him is a different question." "What's the difference?" "Intent. Circumstance. Whether you had a choice." Caleb settled onto the ground across from her, arms resting on his knees. "I knew Thornton, knew the kind of man he was, so I'm asking, what happened?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, slowly, haltingly, she told him. It came out in pieces, fragments that didn't quite connect at first. How Thornton had hired her 6 months ago. How he'd started paying too much attention. How the attention had turned into comments, then touches, then demands. How she'd tried to refuse without losing her job because she needed the money, needed the work, needed something to hold on to in this country that didn't want her. "Tonight he called me to his study," she said, and her voice was flat now, empty. "Said he wanted to discuss my pay, but when I got there, he locked the door, put his hands on me. I tried to push him away and he hit me. Then he—" She touched her torn dress, the buttons that had been ripped away. I saw the gun in his desk drawer. I just wanted him to stop. I wasn't trying to kill him, I just wanted him to let go. Did he? No. He tried to take the gun from me. We fought. It went off. She looked up at Caleb, and there were tears on her face now, silent and bitter. I didn't mean to kill him, but I'm not sorry he's dead. Caleb nodded slowly. It was about what he'd expected. Thornton had always been the type to take what he wanted and damn the consequences. Only this time, the consequences had caught up with him. They won't care, Mei Lin said. Back in town, they won't care what he did or why I fought back. They'll just see a dead white man and a Chinese woman with a gun. I know. So why are we running? Why not just let them have me? You could go back, tell them you tried to stop me, but I got away. They'd believe you. Maybe, Caleb said, but I'd know the truth. And I've spent enough of my life looking the other way when bad things happen to people who don't deserve it. He stood up, brushed the dust off his pants. Get some rest. I'll keep watch. I can't sleep. Try anyway. It's going to be a long ride tonight and you'll need your strength. She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She curled up on the rock with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the fact that the morning was already warming up. After a minute, Caleb took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She pulled it tight without a word. The sun rose slow and red over the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of rust and gold. Caleb sat with his back against a cottonwood tree, rifle across his lap, watching the rim above them for any sign of movement. Smoke grazed on the sparse grass near the stream, content for now. Birds called to each other in the branches overhead, oblivious to the violence and fear that had driven two people into this hidden place. Caleb let his mind drift while he watched. Cottonwood Springs was probably in chaos right now. The sheriff would be organizing a proper search party. Men, horses, supplies for a long hunt. Thornton's friends and business partners would be demanding justice, offering rewards. The story would spread to neighboring towns, get printed in newspapers, turn into something bigger than the truth. And somewhere in all that noise and fury, the actual facts, that a woman had defended herself against a man who was trying to rape her, would get lost completely. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But Caleb had lived long enough to know that fair and right didn't count for much when power and money were involved. Around noon, Mei Lin woke with a gasp, jerking upright like she'd been pulled from a nightmare. Caleb was there in an instant, hand on her shoulder. You're safe, he said. We're still in the canyon. Nobody's found us. She looked around wildly, getting her bearings, and then sagged back against the rock. I thought I was back in his study. I could smell the gunpowder. It was just a dream. It was a memory. She rubbed her face with both hands. How long was I asleep? Few hours. How's the ankle? Hurts. She tried to put weight on it and winced. But I can walk if I have to. You won't have to. Not yet. Caleb handed her some jerky from his saddlebag. Eat something. It's not much, but it's what we've got. They ate in silence, chewing the tough dried meat and washing it down with water from the stream. It was a poor meal, but it filled the empty spaces, gave them something to do besides think about what was coming. Where are we going? Mei Lin asked eventually. After we leave here. There's a settlement about 3 days north called Red Creek. Small place, mostly mining. They don't ask a lot of questions, and they're far enough from Cottonwood Springs that news travels slow. And then what? Then we figure out our next move. Maybe head further north into Wyoming territory. Maybe west toward California. Depends on how close the law gets. Mei Lin was quiet for a moment, picking at a loose thread on Caleb's jacket. You didn't have to do this. You don't even know me. No, Caleb agreed. But I know enough. What do you know? That you're not a murderer. That you fought back when someone tried to hurt you. That you're brave enough to keep going even when everything's gone to hell. He met her eyes. That's enough. She looked away, but not before he saw something shift in her expression. Not quite trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. They spent the rest of the day in the canyon, resting and waiting for darkness. Caleb checked Smoke's hooves and legs, making sure the hard ride hadn't caused any injuries. Mei Lin washed her face and hands in the stream, tried to repair the worst of the damage to her dress with shaking fingers. At one point, Caleb found her staring at her reflection in the water, touching the bruise on her jaw with something like disbelief. Does it hurt much? he asked. Not as much as knowing I'll carry it with me. She pulled her hand away. Every time someone looks at me now, they'll see this. They'll know. Know what? That I'm the woman who killed Samuel Thornton. That I'm dangerous. That I'm not... She trailed off, searching for words. Not safe. Caleb crouched beside her. The people who matter won't see it that way. And how many of those do you think there are in this country? There was no bitterness in her voice, just tired resignation. I've been here 3 years. I've worked in 6 different towns. In every single one, people looked at me like I was something foreign, something that didn't belong, and now I've given them proof. You gave them nothing, Caleb said firmly. Thornton did this, not you. Thornton's dead. I'm the one they'll remember. There wasn't much he could say to that. She was probably right. As the sun began its slow descent behind the canyon rim, Caleb saddled Smoke again and helped Maylin mount up. Her ankle was still bad, but manageable. She'd wrapped it tight with a strip of cloth torn from her already ruined dress, and if she kept her weight off it, she could at least sit a horse without crying out. We're going to ride through the night, Caleb said. Stay off the main trails. Stick to rough ground where tracks are harder to follow. It's going to be uncomfortable and slow, but it's safer than traveling in daylight. I understand. If I tell you to get down and hide, you do it. No questions, no hesitation. Agreed? Agreed. They climbed out of the canyon as the last light bled from the sky, Smoke picking his way carefully up the narrow trail. At the top, Caleb paused to scan the horizon in all directions. Nothing but empty land and the first stars appearing overhead. They headed north. The desert at night was a different world, cold where the day had been hot, silent except for the wind and the occasional cry of a nightbird. The moon rose late, casting everything in silver and shadow. Caleb navigated by the stars and by instinct, avoiding anything that looked like a trail or a road, keeping to the rough country where only someone very determined or very foolish would follow. Around midnight, they stopped to rest the horse and drink water. Maylin slid down from Smoke's back with a barely suppressed groan, her legs stiff from hours in the saddle. How much further to Red Creek? She asked. 2 more days if we keep this pace. Could be faster if we risk the roads, but we're not going to. Because they'll be watching the roads. That's right. Caleb scanned the darkness behind them, seeing nothing but feeling uneasy anyway. They won't give up easy. Thornton had a lot of friends with a lot of money. They'll put together a real hunting party, bring in trackers maybe. How long before they catch up? Depends on how good they are and how lucky we are. Could be never. Could be tomorrow. He looked at her. I won't lie to you, Maylin. The odds aren't great, but they're not impossible either. She nodded, accepting this. If they catch us, what will you do? Keep you alive as long as I can. And if you can't, then I'll make sure they answer for it. It was a grim promise, but she seemed to take some comfort from it. They mounted up again and rode on through the darkness, 2 small figures crossing a vast and indifferent landscape. Dawn found them in rougher country, all broken rock and scattered juniper. Caleb led them into a narrow draw between 2 ridges where they could see anyone approaching from a distance. They'd make camp here for the day, rest again, push on when night fell. As Caleb was unsaddling Smoke, Maylin spoke up from where she sat against a rock. Tell me about yourself. He glanced over, surprised. Why? Because you know everything about me and I know nothing about you. It doesn't seem fair. Fair's got nothing to do with it. Then humor me. There was something almost like amusement in her voice, the first hint of anything other than fear he'd heard since they left Cottonwood Springs. Who is Caleb Rourke? He thought about deflecting, but what was the point? They had nothing but time. Not much to tell, he said, pulling the saddle off and setting it aside. Grew up on a ranch in Texas. Parents died when I was 15. Fever took them both in the same week. After that, I drifted. Worked cattle drives, ranch hand jobs, anything that paid, and didn't ask questions. How did you end up in Cottonwood Springs? Bad luck and worse decisions. He sat down across from her, working a knot out of Smoke's lead rope. 5 years ago, I was working a ranch outside El Paso. Good job, good pay, but the foreman and I had a disagreement. What kind of disagreement? The kind where he thought he could beat a man half to death for spilling a bucket of water, and I thought different. So I hit him, broke his jaw, got myself fired, and run out of Texas. Maylin studied him. And you came here. Eventually, spent a year in New Mexico, another in Colorado. Worked for Thornton for a few weeks until I figured out what kind of man he was. After that, just odd jobs. Enough to get by, not enough to put down roots. Why not? Caleb shrugged. Roots mean staying in one place. Staying in one place means people start expecting things from you. Expectations lead to complications. And complications lead to trouble? Something like that. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're running too, just in a different way." It was an observation, not an accusation, but it hit closer to home than Caleb wanted to admit. He'd been running for a long time, from expectations, from his past, from the possibility of caring about anything enough to fight for it. And now here he was, fighting for a woman he barely knew, because for once in his life, he decided to stop running in the wrong direction. "Maybe," he said finally, "but at least now I'm running towards something instead of just away." "What are you running toward?" "Damned if I know." That pulled a small, unexpected sound from her that might have been a laugh, or might have been something sadder. "We're quite a pair." "Yeah," Caleb said, "we really are." They rested through the heat of the day, taking turns keeping watch. Caleb slept in short, restless intervals, waking at every sound. When it was Mei Lin's turn to watch, he noticed she never actually closed her eyes. Just sat there, staring at the empty horizon like she was expecting the whole world to come pouring over it at any moment. Late afternoon, Caleb woke from a doze to find her trying to stand on her injured ankle, testing it with cautious weight. She saw him watching and quickly sat back down. "It's better," she said. "The swelling's gone down. Don't push it. You'll make it worse." "I need to be able to run. If they find us, running won't save you. I will. That's what I'm here for." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why do you keep doing that?" "Doing what?" "Acting like my survival is your responsibility." "Because right now it is." "I didn't ask for that." "No," Caleb agreed. "But you've got it anyway." Something complicated crossed her face. Gratitude, maybe, or frustration, or both. "I don't want you to die for me." "Then let's both try real hard to stay alive." As darkness fell and they prepared to move again, Caleb noticed Mei Lin moving with more confidence, her ankle clearly improving. She still limped, but it was manageable now. That was good. They'd need every advantage they could get. They rode through another long night, the terrain gradually shifting from desert to something greener, more forgiving. Grassland appeared, then scattered pines. The air got cooler. They were climbing, heading into higher country where water was more plentiful and hiding places more abundant. Just before dawn on the third day, Caleb spotted smoke rising from a valley ahead. "Red Creek?" Mei Lin asked. "That's it." He reined smoke to a stop on the ridge overlooking the settlement. "We'll wait here until full daylight. Go in when there are people around. Easier to blend in." Red Creek was smaller than Cottonwood Springs, maybe 36 buildings clustered around a single muddy street. Most of the activity centered on the mine works at the north end of town, where ore carts moved on tracks and men with dirty faces trudged in and out of the tunnels. It was rough, hard country populated by rough, hard people who'd come here because everywhere else had already chewed them up and spit them out. Perfect, in other words. They rode in just after sunrise, Caleb keeping his head down, Mei Lin hidden behind him. A few people glanced their way, but nobody paid much attention. New faces were common in mining towns. People came and went. Nobody asked where from or where to. Caleb found a boarding house at the edge of town run by a gray-haired woman with shrewd eyes and no interest in small talk. "Need a room," he said. "2 nights? Maybe 3. The woman looked past him at Mei Lin, taking in the bruised face and torn dress. Her expression didn't change. $2 a night, she said. "In advance." "No trouble." "No trouble," Caleb agreed and counted out $6 from his dwindling supply of cash. The room was small and spare, a bed, a washstand, a single chair, but it had a door that locked and walls that blocked the wind, and after 3 days in the open, it felt like luxury. Mei Lin sank onto the bed with a sound that was half sob, half relief. Caleb set his rifle by the door and went to the window, checking the sight lines, the approaches, the ways someone could come at them. "We're safe here?" Mei Lin asked. "For now. Nobody knows us. Nobody cares, but we can't stay long." "How long?" long enough to rest, get supplies, figure out our next move. He turned from the window. You should clean up. There's water in the pitcher. She nodded but didn't move, just sat there on the edge of the bed, looking lost. After a moment, Caleb realized she was shaking again, the adrenaline and fear that had kept her going finally catching up now that they'd stopped. He crouched in front of her, gentle. Hey, we made it. We're here. I killed a man, she whispered. I shot him and watched him die, and now I'm running, and I don't know what happens next, or if there even is a next, or... Breathe, Caleb said. Just breathe. She did. Ragged and uneven, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Caleb stayed where he was, close but not touching, just being present while the storm worked its way through her. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry but devastated. I don't know how to keep doing this, she said. One day at a time, Caleb told her. 1 hour, 1 minute, if that's all you can manage. But you keep going, because the alternative is giving up, and I don't think you're ready to do that. How do you know? Because you're still here. Because you got on that horse and rode through 3 nights of hell, and you're still sitting here talking to me instead of curled up in a ball waiting for the end. That's how I know. She studied his face like she was looking for proof that he believed what he was saying. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. Okay, she said quietly, 1 day at a time. That's right. Caleb left her to rest and went downstairs to talk to the boarding house owner. Her name was Ruth, and she had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed either time. Your wife looks like she's had a rough go, Ruth said, not bothering to phrase it as a question. She's not my wife, and yeah, it's been rough. She in trouble? Not the kind you need to worry about. Ruth considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. There's a general store 2 streets over if you need supplies. Doctor's office next to it if she needs tending. Appreciated. And Rourke? She fixed him with a look. I run a quiet house. People come here to disappear for a while. That's their business. But if someone comes looking and causes a scene, that becomes my business. Nobody's going to cause a scene. See that they don't. Caleb spent the rest of the day gathering what they needed. Food, ammunition, a proper coat for Mei Lin since her dress was barely holding together. He moved careful and watchful, aware that even here, even this far from Cottonwood Springs, danger could find them. When he got back to the room, Mei Lin was asleep on the bed, curled up small with her hand tucked under her cheek like a child. He set the supplies down quietly and took up position in the chair by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the street below. This was temporary. They both knew that. Sooner or later, they'd have to move again, keep running, keep hiding, until either the law gave up or caught them. But for now, for this moment, they had a locked door and a soft bed and a few hours of peace. Caleb figured that was enough to hold on to, at least for tonight. Outside, the sun set over Red Creek in shades of orange and purple. Miners trudged home from the works, tired and hungry. Somewhere a dog barked. Life went on, indifferent to the 2 fugitives hiding in its midst. And in the gathering dark, Caleb Rourke kept watch, rifle ready, knowing that the real running was still ahead of them. They stayed in Red Creek for 5 days instead of 3, not because it was safe, but because Mei Lin's ankle needed the rest, and Smoke had developed a limp that turned out to be a stone bruise on his left front hoof. Caleb spent those days watching the street from the window, listening to conversations in the saloon, waiting for someone to mention Cottonwood Springs or a manhunt or a Chinese woman wanted for murder. Nobody did. Either the news hadn't traveled this far yet, or the miners of Red Creek had better things to worry about than someone else's problems. On the 3rd day, Mei Lin came downstairs for the first time, moving careful on her healing ankle. She'd cleaned up as best she could, washed the blood from her hair, but there was no hiding the bruises that had turned from purple to a sickly yellow-green. People stared. She ignored them. I need to work, she said when she found Caleb outside the boarding house, checking Smoke's hoof. I can't just sit in that room waiting. You need to stay out of sight. I need to feel useful. I need to do something with my hands or I'm going to lose my mind. There was an edge in her voice, sharp and desperate. Please. Caleb straightened up, studying her. The fear was still there in her eyes, but it had been joined by something else, a restless energy that came from too many hours alone with her thoughts. Ruth might need help in the kitchen, he said finally, but you keep your head down, and if anyone asks questions, I won't tell them anything. I'm not stupid. Never said you were. She worked that afternoon and the next day and the day after that, washing dishes and peeling vegetables and doing whatever Ruth needed done. The older woman didn't ask questions, just put Mei Lin to work and paid her in meals and a few coins that went into the small pouch Caleb was trying to build back up. In the evenings, they'd sit in the room and plan, or try to plan. It was hard to make plans when you didn't know what you were planning for. We can't run forever, Mei Lin said on the fourth night, sitting on the bed with her knees pulled up to her chest. Eventually they'll catch up, or we'll run out of money or places to hide. I know. So what do we do? Caleb was cleaning his rifle, the familiar motions giving his hands something to do while his mind worked. There's a place up in the mountains. Old trapping cabin I stayed at years back. Remote. No roads in, just trails. If we can make it there before the snow gets too bad, we could wait out the winter. Let things cool down. And in the spring? In the spring, maybe the law's moved on to other priorities. Maybe Thornton's friends have given up. Maybe we can figure out a way forward that doesn't involve running. Mei Lin was quiet for a long time. You really think they'll give up? No, Caleb admitted. But I think time and distance might make them less motivated. And less motivated men make mistakes. Or we make mistakes. That too. She rested her chin on her knees. This cabin. How far? 2 weeks hard riding, more if the weather turns. He set the rifle aside, looked at her directly. It's going to be rough, Mei Lin. Cold, isolated, nothing but you and me and whatever supplies we can carry. If you're not sure, I'm sure. Her voice was firm. I'd rather freeze in a cabin than hang in Cottonwood Springs. Fair enough. On the fifth morning, Caleb was coming back from the general store when he saw the two riders at the far end of town. They were sitting their horses easy, scanning the street, and something about the way they moved made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He ducked into the alley beside the store and watched. The men were asking questions. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the shopkeeper they were talking to, shaking his head, pointing vaguely north. The riders moved on to the next building, asked again. Caleb didn't wait to see more. He went back to the boarding house through the back alleys, moving fast but not running, trying not to draw attention. Ruth was in the kitchen when he came in. She took one look at his face and said, Trouble? Maybe. Where's Mei Lin? Upstairs. What kind of trouble? The kind that's asking questions about strangers. He headed for the stairs. If anyone comes asking, you never saw us. I don't see half the people who stay here, Ruth said dryly. Makes life simpler. Mei Lin was folding the spare clothes they'd bought, preparing to pack. She looked up when Caleb came in and saw his expression. They're here. Maybe. Two men asking questions. Could be bounty hunters. Could be law. Could be nothing. But I'm not waiting to find out. He grabbed his rifle and saddlebags. We leave now. She didn't argue, just started stuffing things into the bags with shaking hands. Caleb went to the window and watched the street. The two riders were closer now, maybe 3 buildings away. One of them had a piece of paper in his hand, probably a description or a wanted poster. Out the back, Caleb said. Quiet and quick. They left through the rear door of the boarding house, Mei Lin limping but keeping pace. Smoke was in a small stable behind Ruth's property, already saddled because Caleb had learned a long time ago to always be ready to run. He led the horse out while Mei Lin kept watch, then boosted her up and mounted behind her. Which way? She whispered. North. Into the hills. They'll expect us to head for flat ground where we can move fast, so we do the opposite. They walked Smoke through the back lots and alleys of Red Creek, keeping buildings between them and the main street. Once, Caleb heard voices raised in question and answer, too close for comfort, but they kept moving and the voices faded. At the edge of town, the land rose sharply into pine-covered slopes. Caleb urged Smoke up the incline, keeping to the trees, putting distance between them and Red Creek as fast as he dared without leaving an obvious trail. They were maybe a mile out when Mei Lin spoke. Did they see us? Don't know. Don't care. We're not stopping to find out. They climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails and stream beds, anything that wouldn't leave clear tracks. The air got thinner and colder. Snow appeared in patches under the trees, old and crusted from an early storm. By nightfall, they were deep in the high country, surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky and forests so dense the fading light barely penetrated. Caleb found a spot where an overhang of rock created a natural shelter and called a halt. Smoke was breathing hard from the climb, white steam puffing from his nostrils. Maylin slid down from the saddle and immediately sat on a fallen log, her face pale with exhaustion. "We can't make a fire," Caleb said. "Smoke would give us away." "I know." They ate cold beans from a can and drank water that tasted of pine and stone. The temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. Caleb dug out the extra blanket he'd bought in Red Creek and handed it to Maylin. "Wrap up. It's going to be a long night." She did, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders. In the dimness, her eyes were dark holes in her face, exhausted beyond measure. "How much further to this cabin?" she asked. 10 days, maybe 12? Depends on the weather and how hard we push. And if it snows, then it takes longer. She nodded, accepting this. They'd both stopped pretending things were going to get easier. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Caleb and Maylin huddled together under the overhang, sharing body heat, the blankets wrapped around them both. It was the closest they'd been since this whole thing started, close enough that he could feel her shivering, close enough to hear the small sounds of discomfort she tried to suppress. "Tell me about the cabin," she said at some point in the darkness. "What's it like?" "Small. One room, dirt floor, fireplace that works if you know how to clean out the chimney. There's a stream nearby, good hunting in the area if you know where to look." "You lived there before?" "For a winter, 7, 8 years ago. I was running from something, don't even remember what anymore. Holed up there until spring, then moved on." "Were you alone?" "Yeah." "Sounds lonely." "It was," Caleb admitted, "but sometimes lonely is safer than the alternative." Maylin shifted closer, and he could feel her breath against his shoulder. "I was lonely in Cottonwood Springs, even surrounded by people, maybe especially then. Because nobody saw you. Because nobody wanted to. I was just the Chinese girl who cleaned houses and kept her mouth shut. Convenient to have around, easy to ignore." Her voice was soft but bitter. "Thornton was the first person who really looked at me. I thought that meant something. I was wrong." "He looked at you the wrong way. That's on him, not you." "Doesn't change what happened." "No, but it changes what it means." They were quiet after that, listening to the wind move through the pines above them, the small sounds of the forest at night. Somewhere in the darkness, something moved through the underbrush. A deer, maybe, or a fox. The world continued on, indifferent to their suffering. Caleb woke before dawn to find Maylin already up, standing at the edge of the overhang looking out at the mountains. Frost had formed on every surface, turning the world white and crystalline. Her breath made clouds in the frozen air. "We should move," she said without turning around, "before they catch up." If they catch up, Caleb thought, but didn't say. He gathered their gear and saddled Smoke, working quickly in the bitter cold. His fingers were stiff and clumsy, but he managed. They rode higher into the mountains as the sun rose, painting the snowfields pink and gold. The trails got rougher, steeper, until Caleb had to dismount and lead Smoke over sections that were too treacherous to ride. Maylin walked when she could, trying to spare the horse, her ankle holding up better than it had any right to. Around midday, they crested a ridge, and Caleb stopped, staring back the way they'd come. "What is it?" Maylin asked. "Nothing, just checking." But it wasn't nothing. Down below, maybe 3 or 4 miles back, he could see movement, small, dark shapes moving through the trees. Could be elk, could be other travelers, could be the men from Red Creek. "We need to move faster," he said, and urged Smoke forward. The days blurred together after that, cold mornings and colder nights, always climbing, always moving. They rationed the food carefully, but it was running low anyway. Caleb set snares when they stopped and managed to catch a rabbit once, which they ate raw because they still couldn't risk a fire. It was better than nothing. Maylin stopped talking much, conserving her energy. She walked when she could and rode when she couldn't, her face set in lines of determination that made her look older than her years. The bruises had faded, but new hardships had taken their place. Windburn on her cheeks, cracked lips, hands raw from cold. On the 7th day, it started to snow. Not the light dusting they'd been seeing, but real snow, heavy and relentless, falling from a sky the color of old iron. Within an hour, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Within 2 hours, the trail disappeared under a blanket of white. Caleb kept moving because stopping meant freezing, but he was navigating by instinct now, by the vague memory of landmarks he'd seen years ago. The cabin was up here somewhere, tucked into a valley on the north side of a particular ridge, but in the whiteout everything looked the same. "We're lost," Maylin said. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Not lost, just turned around." "Is there a difference?" One sounds more hopeful. Despite everything, that pulled a small sound from her that might have been a laugh. "You're an optimist, Caleb Rourke. Just stubborn." They found the cabin 2 hours before dark, more by luck than navigation. One moment they were struggling through knee-deep snow in what felt like endless forest, and the next the trees opened up and there it was, a low structure of weathered logs with a sagging roof and a door hanging crooked on its hinges. It looked like hell. It looked like salvation. Caleb got Maylin inside first, then led Smoke around to the lean-to on the side that served as a stable. The roof was mostly intact, enough to keep the worst of the snow off. He unsaddled the gelding and rubbed him down with handfuls of dry pine needles, wishing he had grain or hay or anything better to offer. "You did good," he told the horse. "Rest now." Inside the cabin, Maylin had already started assessing their new home. The dirt floor was covered in old pine needles and animal droppings. The fireplace was full of debris. The single window had lost its glass years ago and was now just an opening that let in wind and snow. "It's perfect," Maylin said, and there was no sarcasm in her voice at all. They spent the last of the daylight making the place livable. Caleb cleaned out the fireplace while Maylin swept the floor as best she could with a branch stripped of its twigs. They blocked the window with spare blankets and packed snow into the gaps around the doorframe to stop the draft. When everything was ready, Caleb finally risked a fire. He used the driest wood he could find from the protected areas under the lean-to, building it small and hot. The smoke drew cleanly up the chimney, a small miracle. Within an hour, the cabin had gone from freezing to merely cold. They ate the last of the beans and some hardtack that was more rock than bread. It was a terrible meal. It tasted like hope anyway. That night, wrapped in blankets near the fire, Maylin spoke into the darkness. "Do you think they'll find us here?" Caleb considered lying, then decided she deserved the truth. "Not before spring. The snow will cover our tracks, and even if they figure out which direction we went, nobody's going to search these mountains in winter. It's too dangerous. So we're safe. For now. And when spring comes, we'll deal with spring when it gets here." She shifted, and in the firelight he could see her face, thoughtful and tired. "I used to plan everything. When I left China, I had plans for every step. Where I'd work, how I'd save money, what I'd do when I had enough. And then Thornton happened, and all those plans just..." She made a gesture like scattering dust. "Gone. Plans are overrated anyway," says the man who planned this whole escape. "That wasn't planning. That was improvising very fast." She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her face. "Well, you're good at it." "I've had practice." The snow continued to fall outside, silent and heavy, cutting them off from the world. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows on the log walls. They were safe for the moment, fed and warm and alive. Caleb figured that was enough for one day. The winter settled over them like a blanket. The snow kept falling, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, until the world outside the cabin was nothing but white in all directions. Caleb marked the days by notches on the doorframe, watching them accumulate. 10, 20, 30. They fell into a routine out of necessity. Caleb would wake before dawn to feed the fire and check on Smoke. Maylin would prepare whatever meal they had, beans or salt pork or, on good days, rabbit or squirrel, from the snares Caleb set in the areas he could still reach. They'd eat together in silence or conversation, depending on the day. Then Caleb would bundle up and venture out to hunt or gather wood or check the snares, while Maylin stayed inside, mending clothes or organizing their dwindling supplies, or just sitting by the fire with a distant look in her eyes. Evenings were the hardest. The darkness came early and stayed late, pressing in on the small circle of firelight like it wanted to swallow them whole. They'd sit together, close for warmth, and talk about nothing important or everything important, depending on what they needed to forget or remember. "Tell me about China," Caleb said one night, maybe 3 weeks into their isolation. Maylin looked surprised. "Why?" Because you never talk about it, and I'm curious. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then slowly, she started to speak. I grew up in a village outside Shanghai. Small place, nothing special. My father was a farmer, my mother took in sewing. We were poor but not desperate, just ordinary. Her voice was soft, distant with memory. When I was 16, my mother died. Fever. After that, my father changed. Started drinking, stopped caring. He sold me to a man who promised I'd have work in America, a better life. He sold you? It's not uncommon. Daughters are expensive. In America, I could send money back, help the family. That was the idea anyway. What happened? The man who brought me over put me to work in a laundry in San Francisco. 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, barely enough pay to cover room and board. I did that for a year before I realized I was never going to save enough to help anyone, including myself. So I left, ran away, started over, and ended up in Cottonwood Springs. Eventually, I worked my way through a dozen towns first, always moving, always looking for something better, and every place was the same. People who didn't want me there, jobs that barely paid, the constant feeling of being watched, judged, found lacking. She pulled the blanket tighter. Thornton seemed like an opportunity. Good pay, steady work, a room of my own. I thought maybe I'd finally found a place I could stay. He ruined that. He ruined a lot of things. Her voice was flat. But mostly he ruined the idea that I could ever be safe. Caleb wanted to tell her that she was safe now, here with him, but the words felt hollow. They both knew this cabin was temporary. The safety they'd found was as fragile as the fire that kept them warm. Instead, he said, "You're stronger than you think." I don't feel strong. I feel tired. Being tired and being weak aren't the same thing. She looked at him and something shifted in her expression. How did you get to be so sure about everything? I'm not sure about anything. I'm just good at pretending. That pulled a small laugh from her. We're both pretending then. Maybe that's enough. The days grew shorter and colder. January arrived, brutal and unforgiving. The snow piled up until it reached the cabin's windows, creating a fortress of white that kept them in as much as it kept others out. Caleb had to dig a tunnel just to reach the lean-to to check on smoke. The horse was surviving on bark and pine needles, and the occasional handful of grain Caleb had salvaged from the bottom of his saddlebag. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough. But it was keeping smoke alive, and that was all that mattered. Inside the cabin, supplies dwindled to almost nothing. They were down to salt pork and the last of the hardtack. Caleb's snares caught less and less as the animals either hibernated or moved to lower elevations. He tried hunting, but the snow was too deep, the game too scarce. "We're going to run out of food," Mei Lin said one night, stating the obvious because someone needed to. "I know." "What do we do?" "We ration more carefully. We hope I can catch something. We wait for spring. And if spring doesn't come fast enough?" Caleb didn't have an answer for that. February was worse. The cold intensified until even the fire couldn't fully ward it off. They slept pressed together under every blanket they had, sharing heat like their lives depended on it, which they did. One night, Mei Lin woke screaming. Caleb jerked awake, reaching for his rifle before his brain caught up. Mei Lin was thrashing in the blankets, fighting against something only she could see, her face twisted in terror. Hey! He caught her hands, held them firm. "You're okay. It's just a dream." She fought him for a moment, then her eyes focused and she went still. "I was back in his study. He had his hands on me and I couldn't find the gun and you're not there. You're here, with me, safe." She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "I can't stop seeing it. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. I feel his hands. I hear the gunshot." Caleb pulled her close, let her bury her face against his shoulder. "It's going to take time." "I don't have time. I'm losing my mind in here." "No, you're not. You're surviving. That's all anyone can ask." She clung to him like a drowning person to a piece of driftwood, and Caleb held her and wished he had better comfort to offer. But comfort was in short supply, just like everything else. The nightmares continued after that, maybe every few nights. Sometimes Caleb could wake her before they got bad. Sometimes he couldn't, and he'd just sit there in the dark listening to her cry and feeling utterly useless. During the days, Mei Lin grew quieter, more distant. She'd stand at the door sometimes and stare out at the endless white, her expression unreadable. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked once. "Escape routes," she said, "in case we need to run again." "We're snowed in. There are no escape routes." "There's always an escape route. You just have to be willing to pay the price." That worried him more than he wanted to admit. Late February brought a brief warm spell. The snow softened, the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks. Caleb ventured further from the cabin, desperate to find game. He was gone for hours, following tracks through the melting snow, his rifle ready. He found nothing. When he came back, Maylin was sitting by the fire with something in her hands. As he got closer, he realized it was a knife, and she was looking at it with an expression he didn't like. "What are you doing?" he asked carefully. She looked up, startled. "Nothing. I was just... nothing." "Maylin, I'm fine." "You're sitting here staring at a knife like it's the answer to all your problems. That's not fine." She set the knife down, her hands shaking. "I'm tired, Caleb. I'm so tired of being afraid and hungry and cold and trapped. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of surviving." He crossed the cabin and crouched in front of her. "I know. Do you? Because you seem fine. You seem like you could do this forever." "I'm not fine. I'm barely holding it together, but I do it anyway because the alternative is giving up, and I'm too stubborn for that." "What if I'm not as stubborn as you?" "Then you borrow some of mine. That's what I'm here for." She looked at him, and there were tears on her face now, silent and defeated. "Why do you keep trying to save me?" "Because you're worth saving." "You don't know that. You don't know anything about me." "I know enough. I know you fought back when someone tried to hurt you. I know you've survived things that would break most people. I know you got on a horse and rode through hell with me because you wanted to live." He reached out and took her hand. "That's enough." She squeezed his hand tight, like she was trying to anchor herself. "I don't know how to keep doing this. One day at a time, remember? That's not working anymore." "Then 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 breath. However small you need to make it, that's what you do." They sat there for a long time, hands clasped, while the fire burned low and the wind howled outside. When Maylin finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. "Okay, 1 breath at a time. That's right. And Caleb, thank you." "For what?" "For not letting me give up." March came with more snow, dashing any hopes of an early spring, but something had shifted between them in that moment by the fire. They were closer now, more honest. The walls they'd both been maintaining had started to crack. They talked more. About their pasts, their fears, their hopes for a future that still seemed impossibly distant. Maylin told him about her mother, about the songs she used to sing while she worked. Caleb told her about his parents, about the ranch he'd loved and lost. And slowly, carefully, without either of them quite acknowledging it, something else grew alongside the honesty. Something that went deeper than survival or companionship. It started with small things. The way Maylin would smile when Caleb came back from checking the snares. The way Caleb found himself watching her while she worked, memorizing the curve of her neck, the way her hair fell across her face, the way they gravitated toward each other in the evenings, sitting closer than the cold required. One night, Maylin fell asleep with her head on Caleb's shoulder. He stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid to wake her. When she woke an hour later, she didn't pull away immediately, just stayed there, warm and close, and said quietly, "Is this okay?" "Yeah," Caleb said, his voice rough. "This is okay." After that, it became routine. They'd sit together by the fire, her head on his shoulder or his arm around her waist, and they'd talk or stay silent, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I never thanked you properly," Maylin said one night, "for risking everything to help me. You've thanked me plenty, not for this, for making me want to survive instead of just surviving." She tilted her head to look up at him. "You gave me something to hold on to when I had nothing left." "You did that yourself. I just reminded you it was there." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle on his rough, unshaven jaw. "You're a good man, Caleb Rourke." "I'm really not." "You are to me." And then she kissed him. It was soft and tentative, a question more than a statement. Caleb froze for half a second, then kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her face. It was gentle, careful, both of them aware of how fragile this moment was. When they pulled apart, Mei Lin's eyes were bright. "Was that okay?" she asked. "More than okay." They sat there in the firelight, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell and the world continued its slow turn. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Something had shifted from survival to something deeper, something worth fighting for. "We're going to make it through this," Mei Lin said. "Both of us." "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "We are. And for the first time since that gunshot had ripped through Cottonwood Springs, he actually believed it. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, like it wasn't sure it wanted to return at all. The snow began to melt in fits and starts, revealing the brown earth underneath in patches that grew larger each day. The stream that had been frozen solid started to flow again, first as a trickle, then a steady rush of meltwater. Birds returned, their songs filling the silence that had pressed down on them all winter. Caleb stood outside the cabin on a morning in late March, breathing in air that didn't bite his lungs for the first time in months. The sun felt warm on his face, real warm, not the weak winter version they'd been getting. He could hear Mei Lin moving around inside, humming something soft under her breath. She did that now, hummed while she worked. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. They'd made it. Against the odds, against logic, against the hunger and cold and despair that had tried to swallow them whole, they'd survived the winter. But survival had come with a cost. Their supplies were gone, every last bit. Smoke had lost weight they couldn't afford and developed a cough that worried Caleb more than he let on. And while the snow was melting, they were still weeks away from being able to travel safely down the mountain. "We need food," Mei Lin said, coming to stand beside him. She'd lost weight too, her face thinner, more angular. But her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months, stronger. "Real food, not pine needle tea and hope. I'll set out more snares. The game's coming back now that it's warming up. That'll take days. We need something today." She was right. Caleb scanned the tree line thinking. Then he saw it. Movement on the far slope, maybe a quarter-mile away. A deer picking its way through the melting snow. "Stay here," he said, and went for his rifle. The deer was a young buck, cautious but hungry enough to be out in the open. Caleb approached from downwind, moving slow and quiet, using every bit of cover he could find. His hands were steady despite the fact that this shot meant the difference between eating and starving. Or maybe because of it. He lined up the sight, exhaled, and fired. The buck dropped where it stood. It took him an hour to field dress the animal and drag it back to the cabin. Mei Lin met him halfway, her face bright with something that looked like joy. "You got it," she said, and there was relief in her voice so profound it nearly broke him. "We eat tonight," Caleb said, "and tomorrow, and probably the rest of the week if we're careful." They cooked the venison over the fire, the smell of roasting meat making Caleb's mouth water so badly he had to swallow constantly. When it was ready, they ate until their stomachs hurt, savoring every bite like it was the finest meal they'd ever had. "This is the best thing I've ever tasted," Mei Lin said around a mouthful of meat. "That's starvation talking." "I don't care, it's still true." They ate until they couldn't eat anymore, then sat by the fire with full bellies and something approaching contentment. Outside, the world was coming alive again. Inside, they were doing the same. "When can we leave?" Mei Lin asked, her voice quiet. "Another week, maybe 2. Need to make sure the trails are clear, that we're not going to run into late snow. And Smoke needs to regain some strength before we ask him to carry us down the mountain." "And then what? Where do we go?" It was the question Caleb had been avoiding all winter. He'd been so focused on surviving that he hadn't let himself think about what came after survival. "I don't know," he admitted. "Somewhere far enough from Cottonwood Springs that the law won't find us. Somewhere we can start over." "You think that's possible? Starting over?" "Has to be. Otherwise, what was the point of all this?" Mei Lin leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. It had become natural between them, this closeness. Necessary, even. "I want to believe that. I want to believe we can have something normal. A life that isn't running and hiding." "We will," Caleb said, and tried to make himself believe it too. 2 days later, they heard horses. Caleb was outside gathering wood when the sound drifted up through the trees, the unmistakable jingle of tack and the muffled thud of hooves on wet ground. He dropped the wood and ran for the cabin. "Someone's coming," he said, grabbing his rifle. Get inside and stay quiet. Maylin's face went white, but she didn't argue. She ducked into the cabin while Caleb positioned himself at the corner where he could see the approach but stay hidden. The riders appeared a few minutes later, two men on horseback, moving slow and careful through the terrain. They weren't dressed like bounty hunters or lawmen, just regular travelers, or so it seemed. But Caleb had learned not to trust appearances. One of the men called out, "Hello, the cabin! Anyone home?" Caleb stayed silent, rifle ready. The men looked at each other, then the same one called again. "We're not looking for trouble. Just passing through, saw your smoke. Thought maybe we could trade for some supplies." Trade. That was interesting. Caleb considered his options. They had meat now, more than they could eat before it spoiled, and he had no idea what these men might be carrying. "What kind of supplies?" he called back, not showing himself yet. "Coffee, flour, salt. Got some dried beans, too. We're heading down to Red Creek. Heard there might be work in the mines." Coffee? Caleb hadn't had real coffee in months. The temptation was almost overwhelming. He stepped out from cover, rifle held casual but ready. "All right, come on in slow. Any funny business, and you'll regret it." The men dismounted and approached with their hands visible, clearly experienced enough to know how to move around an armed man in the wilderness. Up close, they looked tired, worn down by travel, but not dangerous. One was older, maybe 50, with gray in his beard. The other was younger, nervous, his eyes darting around like he expected trouble. "Name's Tom Gardner," the older one said. "This is my nephew, Billy. We're just trying to get to the mines before all the good claims are taken." "Caleb Rourke, that's all you need to know." He gestured toward the cabin. "My partner's inside. We've got fresh venison if you want to trade." The men's faces lit up. Fresh meat was worth its weight in gold this time of year. They worked out a trade. 10 pounds of venison for coffee, flour, and a bag of dried beans that looked like heaven in a sack. While they were packing up the meat, Tom glanced toward the cabin. "Your partner doing all right? Noticed you said partner, not wife." "She's fine, why?" Tom held up his hands. "No offense meant, just making conversation." He paused, then added, "You folks been up here all winter?" "Most of it." "Rough way to spend the cold months. Most people would have frozen or starved." "We're not most people." Billy spoke up for the first time. "You hear about the manhunt last fall, out of Cottonwood Springs? They were looking for some Chinese woman who killed a rich man." Caleb's blood went cold, but he kept his face neutral. "Heard something about that." "They catch her?" "Nope. Her and whoever helped her escape just vanished. Sheriff looked for months, offered a big reward, eventually gave up. Figured they either died in the desert or made it to California." Billy shook his head. "Crazy story. Can you imagine? A woman shooting a man like Samuel Thornton?" "Can't imagine much surprises me anymore," Caleb said carefully. "You boys should get moving if you want to make Red Creek before dark." Tom caught the dismissal in his tone and nodded. "Right. Thanks for the meet, Mr. Rourke. Good luck to you and your partner." They mounted up and rode away, disappearing into the trees. Caleb stood there for a long time, making sure they were really gone before going back to the cabin. Mei Lin was standing by the door, her face pale. "I heard everything. They said the search was called off. They said the sheriff gave up. That's not the same thing." "Maybe, but it's something." Caleb set down the supplies they'd traded for. "At least we know we're not being actively hunted anymore." "Or they're lying, setting a trap." "They weren't lying. I've seen enough liars to know the difference." He started unpacking the supplies. "They thought we died in the desert or made it to California. That's good for us. Means nobody's looking in the mountains." Mei Lin sat down slowly, processing this. "So what do? We wait another week like we planned. Then we head down, but not to Red Creek. Somewhere else. Somewhere new. And if someone recognizes me, they won't. It's been 6 months. You look different, and we'll be far from Cottonwood Springs. People see what they expect to see, and nobody expects to see you anymore." She wanted to believe him. He could see it in her eyes, the desperate hope fighting against the fear that had become her constant companion. "Okay," she said finally. "One more week." That week passed in a strange mix of anxiety and preparation. They smoked what was left of the venison, packed their meager belongings, got smoke as ready as they could for the journey down. The horse was better, eating grass again now that the snow had melted enough to expose it, but he still had that cough. On their last night in the cabin, Mei Lin stood in the doorway looking out at the stars. "I should hate this place," she said. "We nearly died here. We were hungry and cold and trapped, but I don't hate it." Caleb came to stand beside her. "Why not?" "Because this is where I learned I was stronger than I thought. This is where I stopped running from what happened and started facing it." She turned to look at him. "This is where I found you, really found you, not just the man who helped me escape, but the person underneath. We found each other." She took his hand, laced their fingers together. "What happens when we leave here? What happens to us? What do you want to happen?" "I want to stop being afraid. I want to build something that can't be taken away. I want—" She paused, searching for words. "I want a life with you, if you'll have me." Caleb pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I'd have you any way I could get you." "That's not an answer." "Yes," he said firmly. "Yes. I want a life with you, whatever that looks like, wherever it takes us. Yes." She turned in his arms and kissed him, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. This was certainty. This was choice. This was two people who'd survived the worst and decided they wanted to face whatever came next together. They left at dawn, taking one last look at the cabin that had sheltered them through the darkest winter of their lives. Caleb had carved their initials into the doorframe, a small mark that said they'd been here, they'd survived, they'd mattered. The journey down was easier than the journey up had been, the trails mostly clear, the weather holding. They moved slow, careful, letting smoke set the pace. At night they made camp in sheltered spots and talked about the future like it was something that might actually happen. "I want land," Caleb said one evening, "a piece of ground that's mine. Ours. Something nobody can take away." "How would we get that? We barely have money for food." "I don't know yet, but I'll find a way. I'm done drifting, Mei Lin. I'm ready to put down roots." "Even with me? Even knowing what people will say about a white man and a Chinese woman? Especially with you. Let them say whatever they want. I'm done caring what people think." She smiled in the firelight. "You say that now. Wait until we're actually dealing with it." "I mean it. I've spent my whole life worrying about other people's opinions, living small so I don't make waves. I'm tired of it. I want to live big, with you." 3 days down the mountain, they spotted a rider coming up the trail. Caleb's hand went to his gun, but the rider raised both hands in a peaceful gesture. "Easy there," the man called. "Just passing through." He was older, 60 maybe, with the look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. A federal marshal's badge glinted on his vest. Caleb's stomach dropped. Beside him, Mei Lin had gone rigid. The marshal rode closer, his eyes moving between them with professional assessment. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "Name's Marshal John Pritchard. I'm looking for someone. A woman, Chinese, traveling with a man who matches your description." He paused. "You wouldn't happen to be Mei Lin Zhao and Caleb Rourke, would you?" There was no point in lying. The marshal clearly knew. "We would," Caleb said, his hand still near his gun. "What do you want with us?" "To give you some news. May I approach?" Caleb nodded slowly. The marshal rode closer, then dismounted, moving slow and easy. He pulled some papers from his saddlebag. "I've been tracking you two since Red Creek. Took me a while. You covered your trail well." He looked at Mei Lin. "Miss Zhao, I'm here to inform you that all charges against you have been dropped." The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible to process. "What?" Mei Lin's voice was barely a whisper. "Dropped, dismissed. You're a free woman." Pritchard handed her the papers. Turns out Samuel Thornton had a history nobody wanted to talk about. After you ran, some of his other employees came forward. Housekeepers, kitchen staff, women who'd been too afraid to speak up before. They corroborated your story. Said Thornton had a pattern of forcing himself on women who worked for him. Caleb felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Why didn't they say something during the manhunt? Fear mostly. Thornton's friends controlled Cottonwood Springs, but one of them, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd worked for Thornton 2 years prior, she went to the territorial governor's office, made a formal complaint, brought other women with her, started an investigation. Once that got rolling, The truth came out. Maylin was staring at the papers in her hands like they might disappear. So I'm not wanted anymore? No, ma'am. The territorial court reviewed the evidence and ruled it self-defense. There's a formal pardon with the governor's seal and everything. Pritchard gestured to the papers. You're free to go anywhere, do anything. You're not a fugitive anymore. Tears were streaming down Maylin's face, but she was smiling, actually smiling. Caleb put his arm around her, holding her up because she looked like she might fall. What about me? Caleb asked. I helped her escape. Technically, you aided a fugitive. But given that she's been pardoned, and given that you were helping someone who is innocent, the court's not interested in pursuing charges. Consider yourself in the clear too, Mr. Rourke. It was too much to take in. 6 months of running, hiding, barely surviving, and now this. Freedom, just like that. Why come all this way to tell us? Caleb asked. You could have just waited for us to come down. Could have, but I've been a marshal for 30 years. I've seen a lot of innocent people get destroyed by systems that don't care about truth. You two deserve to know as soon as possible. Pritchard tipped his hat. Besides, I wanted to see for myself the people who survived a winter in these mountains. That takes backbone. Thank you, Maylin said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for coming all this way. Just doing my job, ma'am. He mounted his horse again. There's one more thing. The territorial government seized Thornton's assets to settle his debts and make restitution to the women he hurt. But there was a life insurance policy. Turns out you were listed as a beneficiary, Miss Zhao. What? That's impossible. It's right there in his papers. Probably did it for tax purposes or as a way to keep you dependent on him. Either way, it's legal and binding. $5,000 will be waiting for you at the territorial office in Denver when you're ready to claim it. $5,000. It was more money than Caleb had seen in his entire life. Maylin looked stunned. I don't want his money. It's your money now. Do with it what you will. Pritchard gathered his reins. I'll be heading back down the mountain if you want to travel together. Safety in numbers and all that. We'll catch up, Caleb said. Need a minute to process this. Understood. I'll be at the base camp 2 miles down if you change your mind. The marshal rode away, leaving them alone with the impossible news. Maylin was still staring at the papers, reading them over and over like she couldn't quite believe they were real. Finally, she looked up at Caleb. We're free, she said, and started to laugh. It was a wild sound, uncontrolled, edged with hysteria. We're actually free. Caleb pulled her close, feeling his own laughter bubbling up. They stood there in the middle of the trail, holding each other and laughing like fools, releasing months of fear and tension in great heaving waves. When they finally calmed down, Maylin pulled back and looked at him seriously. You said you wanted land, a place to put down roots. I did. $5,000 could buy that. A good piece of land, enough to start a ranch, build a real life. She took his hand. Our life. Together. That's your money, Maylin. You earned it in blood and fear. You should use it for yourself. I am using it for myself. I'm investing it in our future. She squeezed his hand. Unless you don't want that, unless this was just survival and I misread, you didn't misread anything, Caleb interrupted. I want that future more than I've wanted anything in my life. I just needed to make sure you wanted it too. I want it. I want you. I want the land and the ranch and the life we're going to build. She smiled. I want everything we almost died for. They rode down the mountain together, taking their time, savoring the feeling of moving towards something instead of away from it. At the base camp, Marshal Pritchard was waiting with coffee and a knowing smile. Figured you two would want to head to Denver, he said. Claim that money, make it official. We do, Maylin said, but not right away. First we need to find somewhere to settle, look at land, figure out where we belong. Any thoughts on where that might be? Caleb looked at Maylin, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that needed no words. Somewhere new, Caleb said. Somewhere nobody knows us or cares about where we came from. Somewhere we can just be. Wyoming Territory's opening up, Pritchard suggested. Homestead Act's bringing in settlers. Government's giving away land to anyone willing to work it. Might be what you're looking for. Might be, Caleb agreed. They traveled with Pritchard for 3 days, then parted ways when the marshal had to head east for his next assignment. Before he left, he shook both their hands. "You two take care of each other," he said, "and don't let the past define you. You've been given a second chance. That's rarer than you think." "We won't waste it," Mei Lin promised. They rode west, then north, following rumors and recommendations toward the open lands of Wyoming. They stopped in small towns along the way, asking about available land, getting a feel for the places they passed through. Some towns were hostile. People stared at Mei Lin, made comments under their breath, made it clear they weren't welcome. Caleb would feel his jaw tighten, his hand drift toward his gun, but Mei Lin would touch his arm and shake her head. "Not worth it," she'd say quietly. "We're not staying here anyway." Other towns were better, friendlier, or at least indifferent. They'd rest there for a day or two, gathering information, then move on. It was in a town called Cedar Ridge that they found it, a notice posted at the general store about land for sale. 300 acres along a river valley, good water, sheltered from the worst winds, previous owner had died without heirs. The land agent was a practical man who cared more about money than origins. He showed them the property, riding out with them to see the boundaries. It was beautiful. Rolling grassland with stands of cottonwood along the river, hills rising in the distance, mountains on the horizon. There was already a small house, rough but sound, and a barn that needed work but had good bones. "What do you think?" Caleb asked Mei Lin quietly, while the agent waited at a respectful distance. She stood in the middle of the empty land, turning slowly to take it all in. The wind caught her hair, and she smiled, really smiled, in a way he hadn't seen since before Cottonwood Springs. "I think this is home," she said. They bought the land with Mei Lin's money, every dollar of it going toward the purchase, improvements, and enough livestock to start a small herd. The agent drew up the papers listing both their names as owners, and if he had opinions about that arrangement, he kept them to himself. Their first night in the house, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over their land. Their land. It still didn't feel real. "We did it," Mei Lin said softly. "We actually did it." "Yeah, we did. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to show up and take it all away." Caleb took her hand. "Nobody's taking anything from us. Not anymore. We fought too hard for this." She leaned against him and they sat there in the growing dark, two people who'd survived the worst and come out the other side stronger, scarred but whole. "Thank you," Mei Lin said. "For what?" "For believing me when nobody else would, for risking everything to help me, for staying when you could have run." She turned to look at him. "For choosing me." "I'd choose you every time," Caleb said. "In every version of this story, I'd choose you." She kissed him then, gentle and sure, and it felt like a promise, like a beginning. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The river murmured over stones, the wind moved through the grass like breathing, and on the porch of their new home, two fugitives who weren't fugitives anymore held each other and watched the stars come out, knowing that tomorrow they'd start building the life they'd almost died for, the life they'd earned, the life that was finally, impossibly, undeniably theirs. The first year was harder than either of them expected. Not the kind of hard they'd faced in the mountains, where survival itself was the daily question. This was different. This was the slow, grinding work of building something from almost nothing, of turning raw land and stubborn hope into an actual life. Caleb spent his days mending fences, repairing the barn, breaking ground for crops they'd plant in the spring. His hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again. Some mornings he could barely straighten his back, but he'd look out at the land, their land, and keep working. Mei Lin tackled the house with the same determination she'd used to survive the winter. She patched the roof, replaced broken windows with salvaged glass from Cedar Ridge, scrubbed years of neglect from the floors and walls. She planted a garden, fought with the rocky soil, coaxed vegetables from ground that didn't want to give anything up. They learned together how to read the weather, how to manage livestock, how to make a dollar stretch further than seemed possible. Some days they succeeded. Some days they failed spectacularly. "The chicken coop fell down again," Caleb announced one evening, covered in dust and frustration. Mei Lin looked up from the stove where she was attempting to make bread that kept coming out like rocks. "Did you use the nails I told you to use?" "I used nails." "The right nails? There's a wrong kind of nail?" She laughed despite herself. "We're terrible at this." Absolutely terrible, Caleb agreed, dropping into a chair. But we're getting less terrible every day. And they were. Slowly, painfully, through trial and error and sheer stubborn persistence, the ranch began to take shape. The barn got properly repaired, the fences held, the garden produced actual vegetables. The small herd of cattle they'd bought grew healthy and fat on the good grassland. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It was the people. Cedar Ridge was a small town, and small towns ran on gossip and suspicion. A white man and a Chinese woman living together, unmarried, claiming to own land together. It raised eyebrows, generated talk, made them targets for speculation, and worse. The first time someone spat at Mei Lin's feet in the general store, Caleb had started forward with his fists clenched. She'd grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise. "Don't," she said quietly. "It's what they want, an excuse. I'm not going to let them treat you like what I am, an outsider?" Her voice was bitter but controlled. "They've been treating me like this my whole life, Caleb. You fighting them won't change it. It'll just give them a reason to run us out." He hated that she was right, hated that she'd learned to accept this kind of treatment as inevitable. But he also understood that choosing their battles was part of survival in a different way now. Not everyone was hostile. The banker, a practical man named Morrison, treated them fairly because their money was as good as anyone's. The doctor's wife, a quiet woman named Eleanor, nodded politely when they passed. A few ranchers, too busy with their own struggles to care about someone else's business, left them alone. But there were enough hostile faces, enough muttered comments, enough cold shoulders to make it clear they weren't welcome. Not really. They were tolerated because they paid their bills and kept to themselves, but they'd never be part of the community. "Does it bother you?" Mei Lin asked one night, 6 months into their new life. "The way people look at us?" They were sitting on the porch, the day's work done, watching the last light fade from the sky. It was Caleb's favorite time, the quiet hour between labor and sleep when the land seemed to breathe. "Yeah," he admitted, "it bothers me, but not enough to leave." "What if it gets worse?" "Then it gets worse. We'll handle it." He looked at her. "You having second thoughts?" "No, just wondering if you are. You could have an easier life without me." "I could have a lot of things without you. Easy isn't one of them. Happy is." He reached for her hand. "I made my choice, Mei Lin. I'm not taking it back." She squeezed his fingers. "We should get married." The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and enormous. "What?" "Married. Legally. It might make things easier. Give us some protection." She was trying to sound practical, but he could hear the uncertainty underneath. "Unless you don't want to." "I want to," Caleb said immediately. "I want to more than anything. But I want to do it because we want to, not because we're trying to appease people who don't respect us anyway. Can it be both?" He considered this. "Yeah, I guess it can." They married quietly in front of a justice of the peace in Cedar Ridge 2 weeks later. No ceremony, no celebration, just papers signed and filed. The justice looked uncomfortable the entire time, rushing through the words like he wanted to be done with the whole business. Walking out of that office with Mei Lin's hand in his, both of them legally bound together, felt more momentous than Caleb had expected. This was real now, permanent, not just survival or convenience or two people clinging to each other in the dark. This was choice, commitment, a declaration that they belonged to each other regardless of what the world thought. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, trying out the words. She smiled. "It sounds strange." "Good strange or bad strange?" "Just strange. I've been Mei Lin Zhao my whole life. Being someone different feels like putting on new clothes that don't quite fit yet." "You're still you, just with a different name." "I know, but names matter. They're how people see you, how you see yourself." She looked up at him. "Do you think this will change anything with the town?" "Probably not, but at least now nobody can say we're living in sin. They'll find something else to say." She was right. They did. But the marriage papers did provide one thing they hadn't expected, a strange kind of legitimacy. They were still outsiders, still the subject of gossip and suspicion, but now they were married outsiders. It was a small shift, but it mattered. The second year brought different challenges. The ranch was running better now, producing enough to live on with a little left over. They'd hired a drifter named Jack to help with the heavy work, an older man who didn't talk much and didn't care about anyone's business but his own. He worked hard, ate his meals in the bunkhouse, and kept his opinions to himself. But as the ranch stabilized, other cracks appeared. Maylin grew quieter. She still worked from dawn to dusk, still kept the house and the garden, and did everything that needed doing. But there was a distance in her eyes sometimes, a faraway look that worried Caleb. "You all right?" he asked one evening, finding her sitting on the porch long after dinner should have been ready. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been sitting here for an hour staring at nothing." She was quiet for a long moment. "Do you ever think about that night in Thornton's study?" "Sometimes. I think about it every day, every single day." Her voice was flat, empty. "I see his face. I feel his hands. I hear the gunshot. And I know it was self-defense. I know I had no choice, but it doesn't change the fact that I killed someone." Caleb sat down beside her. "You survived someone who was trying to hurt you. That's different, is it? Because some days it doesn't feel different. Some days it feels like I'm still running, just in a different way. What can I do?" "Nothing. There's nothing anyone can do." She looked at him, and her eyes were devastated. "I thought getting away would be enough. I thought building this life would make it better. But the past doesn't go away just because you run from it." "No," Caleb agreed quietly. "It doesn't. You just get better at carrying it." They sat there in this darkness, two people learning that survival was only the first step. Healing was something else entirely, and it didn't come with a timeline or a guarantee. The nightmares came back after that conversation. Not as often as they'd been in the cabin, but regular enough that Caleb learned to sleep light, ready to wake her before the dreams got too bad. Some nights he'd hold her while she cried. Other nights she'd push him away, needing space to fight her demons alone. He learned not to take it personally, learned that sometimes the best thing he could do was just be there, solid and present, when she was ready to come back. "I'm broken," she said one night after a particularly bad dream. "You're not broken, you're hurt. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Broken things can't be fixed. Hurt things can heal." He brushed the hair back from her face. "You're healing, Maylin. It just takes time." "What if I never heal all the way?" "Then you don't. But you keep living anyway. You keep building this life we started. You keep choosing to get up every morning." He held her gaze. "That's not broken. That's the strongest thing a person can do." The third year brought unexpected grace. Eleanor, the doctor's wife, showed up at their door one morning with a basket of preserves and an invitation. "I'm starting a ladies' reading circle," she said, her voice nervous but determined. "Meeting once a month to discuss books and current events. I wondered if you might like to join us, Mrs. Rourke." Maylin was so surprised she almost dropped the basket. "You want me to join?" "If you'd like to. No pressure, of course, but I thought, I thought you might enjoy the company." It was a small thing, a tiny olive branch extended from one woman to another, but it meant everything. Maylin attended the first meeting with her shoulders tense, ready for rejection or hostility. Instead, she found 6 women who were curious about her, willing to listen, treating her like a person instead of a problem. Not all of them were warm. One woman barely spoke to her. Another asked pointed questions about China that bordered on rude. But Eleanor steered the conversation back to books, and the others followed her lead, and by the end of the evening, Maylin came home with something like hope in her eyes. "How was it?" Caleb asked. "Strange. Good strange." She was smiling, really smiling. "They treated me like I belonged there, like I had something to contribute." "You do. I know. But it's different when other people know it too." The reading circle became a regular part of her life. Once a month, she'd ride into town, spend an afternoon with these women, and come back a little lighter than she'd left. It didn't solve everything. The town still had plenty of people who looked at her with suspicion or disdain. But it was a start. Meanwhile, Caleb was building connections of his own. The neighboring ranchers, seeing that he knew how to work and wasn't trying to cause trouble, started including him in the informal network of cooperation that kept everyone alive out here. When his fence went down, they helped him fix it. When their cattle got mixed with his during a storm, he helped sort them out. It was grudging acceptance, not friendship, but it was something. One evening, a rancher named Tom Hayes stopped by with a bottle of whiskey and a proposition. "Some of us are talking about forming a cattlemen's association," he said, settling onto the porch. "Pool resources, coordinate on sales, help each other out during rough times. Wondered if you'd want to be part of it." Caleb poured them both a drink. "Why me?" "Because you work hard, you're fair, and you've got good land. Also because Eleanor read me the riot act about how we've been treating you and your wife, and she's scary when she's angry." That surprised a laugh out of Caleb. "She is at that. Look, I'm not going to pretend everyone's happy about having you around. Some folks have opinions, and they're not likely to change them. But you've earned respect, even if it's quiet respect. This association we're forming, it's about the work, not about who you are or where your wife came from. If you're interested, we'd have you." It was the most honest conversation Caleb had ever had with another rancher in Cedar Ridge. He appreciated it. "I'm interested," he said. They shook on it, and just like that, Caleb Rourke had a place in the community. Not a warm place, not an easy place, but a place nonetheless. The fourth year brought loss and renewal in equal measure. Smoke, the horse who'd carried them through hell and gotten them to safety, finally succumbed to the lung disease that had been slowly killing him. Caleb found him in the pasture one morning, lying peaceful in the grass like he'd just decided to rest and never got up. He buried the gelding on a hill overlooking the ranch, Mei Lin standing beside him with tears streaming down her face. "He saved us," she said. "Without him, we'd never have made it. I know. It doesn't seem right that he's gone and we're still here. He did his job, got us where we needed to be. Now he can rest." Caleb put the last shovelful of dirt on the grave. "That's all any of us can ask for." They stood there for a long time, saying goodbye to the horse that had carried them to freedom. But loss wasn't the only thing the year brought. In the spring, Mei Lin came to him with news that made his heart stop. "I'm pregnant," she said, and her face was a mix of joy and terror. Caleb's mind went blank. Then it flooded with 1,000 thoughts at once. Fear, excitement, worry, hope, all tangled together until he couldn't separate them. "You're sure?" "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. I'm due in November." He pulled her close, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "I'm terrified, but yeah, I'm happy. Are you?" "I don't know. I'm scared. What if I'm not good enough? What if something goes wrong? What if the town can think whatever it wants? This is our child, our family." He pulled back to look at her. "We've survived everything else. We can survive this too." The pregnancy was difficult. Mei Lin was sick for months, could barely keep food down, lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dr. Patterson, the same doctor who'd been coolly professional before, showed genuine concern, checking on her regularly, giving Caleb instructions on how to help. "She needs rest," he said, "and as much good food as you can get into her. The baby's taking everything she's got." Caleb did everything he could. He took over her work in the house and garden. He cooked meals she could tolerate. He held her hair when she was sick and rubbed her back when it ached and stayed awake nights when she couldn't sleep. The women from the reading circle rallied around her. Eleanor brought soups and broths. Others brought baby clothes they'd saved from their own children. Even the woman who'd been cold to her softened, offering advice on handling morning sickness. "You're one of us now," Eleanor said simply when Mei Lin tried to thank her. "This is what we do." It was the first time anyone in Cedar Ridge had said Mei Lin belonged. The baby came early, on a cold November night when the first snow was falling. Mei Lin's labor was long and hard, 16 hours of pain that had Caleb pacing the floor and Dr. Patterson looking worried. "I can't do this," Mei Lin gasped at one point, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Yes, you can," Eleanor said firmly. She'd insisted on being there, wouldn't take no for an answer. "You're the strongest woman I know. You survived things that would kill most people. You can survive this too. It hurts. I know it hurts. But pain ends. Your baby is forever. Keep going." And she did. She bore down and screamed and fought through the agony until finally, as dawn was breaking, a thin cry filled the room. "It's a girl," Dr. Patterson announced, holding up a tiny red-faced infant who was wailing her displeasure at being born. Caleb looked at his daughter and felt something break open in his chest. She was perfect. Impossibly small, squalling and angry, and absolutely perfect. "Let me see her," Maylin said weakly. The doctor placed the baby in her arms, and Maylin's face transformed. All the pain, all the fear, all the exhaustion, it melted away, replaced by wonder. "Hello," she whispered to the baby. "Hello, little one. I'm your mother." The baby quieted at her voice, dark eyes opening to stare up at this new world she'd entered. "She's beautiful," Caleb said, sitting on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch his daughter's tiny hand. She gripped his finger with surprising strength. "What should we name her?" Maylin asked. They'd discussed names for months without deciding on anything. But looking at his daughter now, watching the morning light streaming through the window and painting everything gold, Caleb knew. "Hope," he said. "Her name is Hope." Maylin smiled through tears. "Hope Rourke, yes, that's perfect." The baby changed everything and nothing all at once. Their days became a blur of feedings and diaper changes and the particular exhaustion that came with caring for an infant. The ranch work still needed doing, the bills still needed paying, the world still turned. But now there was this small person at the center of it all, demanding attention and love and everything they had to give. Caleb had never been so tired in his life. He'd also never been happier, watching Maylin with hope, the fierce protectiveness, the gentle care, the way she sang old Chinese lullabies her mother had taught her. He fell in love with her all over again in a different way. She was still the woman who'd survived Thornton's attack, still the fugitive who'd ridden through the desert, still the partner who'd nearly frozen in the mountains. But now she was also a mother, and that added dimensions to her he was still discovering. The town's attitude shifted again with Hope's birth. It was harder to hate a baby, harder to maintain prejudice when confronted with something so innocent and new. People who'd been cold started nodding politely. Shopkeepers who'd been curt became helpful. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was closer than they'd been before. "It's because she's half white," Maylin said one evening, nursing Hope while Caleb cleaned up from dinner. "They can accept her in a way they never accepted me. Does that bother you?" "Yes, but I'll use it anyway. If Hope has an easier path because of how she looks, I'll take it. I won't apologize for wanting my daughter to have a better life than I did." "She will," Caleb said. "We'll make sure of it." The years that followed proved him right. Hope grew from infant to toddler to child, bright and curious and fearless in the way children are when they're loved and secure. She learned to walk by pulling herself up on fence posts, learned to talk in a mix of English and the Chinese phrases Maylin taught her, learned to ride before she was 4. The ranch prospered. Good years and bad years, but more good than bad. The cattle herd grew. They added horses, chickens, a few pigs. The house got additions. A proper bedroom for Hope, a larger kitchen, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Caleb's back complained on cold mornings and his hands showed the scars of 1,000 small injuries. Maylin's hair started showing gray at the temples, her face gaining lines that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure. They were getting older. The years were marking them both, but they were here. They'd built this. 5 years after Hope's birth, a second child came, a boy they named James. And 3 years after that, another girl, Sarah. The house filled with noise and chaos, and the particular joy that comes from children who know they're loved. Cedar Ridge changed too. New families moved in, bringing different attitudes and fresh perspectives. The old guard who'd been so hostile either softened or died off, replaced by people who cared more about whether you were a good neighbor than where your wife came from. By the time Hope was 10, Mei Lin was serving on the school board. Caleb had been elected to the Cattlemen's Association leadership. They weren't outsiders anymore. They were pillars of the community, respected and valued. It hadn't been easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But they'd done it. One evening, when Hope was 12 and the younger children were asleep, she asked her mother about the scars on her wrists, old marks, faded but still visible, that Mei Lin usually kept covered. "How did you get those?" Hope asked with the blunt curiosity of children. Mei Lin looked at Caleb, a question in her eyes. They'd always known this conversation would come eventually. They'd just hoped it would be later. "Sit down," Mei Lin said. "I'll tell you a story." She told it carefully, leaving out the worst details but not hiding the truth. How she'd come to America looking for a better life. How she'd been hurt by a man in power. How she'd fought back. How how she'd run, and how Caleb had helped her, and how they'd survived a winter that should have killed them. Hope listened with wide eyes, not interrupting, taking it all in. "You killed someone?" she asked when the story was done. "I defended myself against someone who was trying to hurt me," Maylin corrected gently. "There's a difference." "And people wanted to hang you for it?" "Yes." "That's not fair." "No," Maylin agreed. "It wasn't. The world isn't always fair, especially to people who are different or powerless. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. It means you fight harder." Hope thought about this. "Is that why you and Papa work so hard? Why you're always helping people even when they're not nice to you?" "Part of it. But mostly we do it because we choose to. Because we decided a long time ago that we wanted a life worth living. And that means building something good, something that lasts." "Did the bad man ever get punished?" "In his own way. The truth came out. People learned what kind of person he really was. Sometimes that's the best justice you can hope for." Hope was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said, "I'm glad you fought back, Mama. I'm glad you didn't let him win." Maylin pulled her daughter close, tears in her eyes. "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." Later that night, after Hope had gone to bed, Caleb found Maylin standing at the window, looking out at the ranch. "You all right?" he asked. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, about everything we survived to get here." She turned to face him. "Do you ever regret it? Helping me that night? Everything that came after?" "Not once. Not even during the hard parts. Especially not during the hard parts. That's when it mattered most." He crossed to her, took her hands in his. "You gave me a reason to stop running for my own life. You gave me a purpose, a family, a home. How could I regret any of that? We were just trying to survive." At first, maybe, but somewhere along the way it became more than that. It became about building something, about choosing each other every day, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. He smiled. "That's not survival, Maylin. That's living." She leaned into him, and he held her the way he'd held her 100 times before. In the stable in Cottonwood Springs, on horseback fleeing into the desert, in the freezing cabin, through nightmares and childbirth and every hard moment in between. "I love you," she said. "I don't say it enough, but I do. I know. I love you too." They stood there together, looking out at the life they'd built, the land they'd claimed, the future they'd fought for. 3 children sleeping safely in their beds, a ranch that ran smooth and profitable, neighbors who'd become friends, a place in a community that had tried to reject them and ended up accepting them instead. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There were still people in Cedar Ridge who looked at Maylin sideways, still comments muttered behind hands, still prejudices that wouldn't die. But those voices were quieter now, drowned out by louder voices that said she belonged, that they both belonged, that their family was part of the fabric of this place. On a spring day 15 years after they'd first arrived, Caleb stood on the hill where they'd buried smoke and looked down at the ranch spread out below. The house had grown, the barn had been rebuilt twice, the fences stretched further than they had in the beginning. Cattle dotted the pastures, horses grazed in the corral. Smoke from the chimney rose into the clear blue sky. He could see Hope teaching Sarah to ride in the paddock, patient and encouraging. James was helping Maylin in the garden, more interested in digging holes than planting seeds, but trying his best. The dogs were barking at something only they could see. Life was happening, normal and loud and beautifully mundane. This was what they'd run for. This was what they'd survived for. Not just to escape death, but to build a life worth living. To create something that mattered, that would outlast them, that would give their children the foundation they'd never had. Caleb thought about the man he'd been in Cottonwood Springs, drifting, purposeless, running from anything that required commitment. That man was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that the things worth having were the things you fought for. That love wasn't just a feeling, but a choice you made every single day. That family wasn't about blood or origin or what anyone else thought. It was about the people you chose to stand beside when everything went to hell. He thought about Maylin, who'd survived things that would have destroyed a lesser person, who'd been beaten down and stood back up, who'd killed a man to protect herself and then had to live with that weight, who'd been hunted and feared and judged and had chosen to build a life anyway, to raise children, to forgive the people who'd hurt her without forgetting the lessons they'd taught. She was the strongest person he'd ever known. Not because she was unbreakable, she'd broken plenty of times, he'd been there for most of them, but because she kept putting herself back together and choosing to keep going. That was real strength. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain have the final word. Mei Lin joined him on the hill, slipping her hand into his like she'd done 1,000 times before. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How lucky I am." "Lucky?" She raised an eyebrow. "We nearly died. Multiple times. And we didn't. We survived, and we built this, and now we're standing here watching our children play on land that belongs to us. If that's not luck, I don't know what is." She smiled, the expression softening the lines time had carved into her face. "Maybe it's not luck. Maybe we earned it. Maybe we did." They stood together in the spring sunshine, watching the life they'd created unfold below them. The children's laughter drifted up the hill. The wind moved through the grass. The mountains stood sentinel in the distance, the same mountains that had nearly been their tomb and had instead become their salvation. Somewhere out there, beyond the boundaries of their land, the world continued on. Towns rose and fell. People lived and died. Justice worked or failed depending on who had power and who didn't. Nothing was guaranteed. Nothing was fair. But here, on this hill, on this land, in this moment, two people who'd survived the worst the world could throw at them stood together and knew they'd won. Not because they'd conquered anything or proven anyone wrong, but because they'd refused to give up. Because they'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through everything. "We should get back," Mei Lin said eventually. "Dinner won't cook itself." "In a minute," Caleb pulled her closer. "Let's just stay here a little longer." So they did. They stood on the hill and watched the sun move across the sky, watched their children play, watched the ranch breathe and live and be. They held each other and remembered the night that had started all of this, a gunshot in Cottonwood Springs that had ended one life and saved another. That moment had defined them, but it hadn't destroyed them. Instead, it had led them here, to this land, this family, this hard-won peace that they'd earned with blood and fear and determination. The woman who'd been hunted through the streets had become the heart of a home. The man who'd risked everything for a stranger had found his purpose. And together they'd built something that would outlast the prejudice and the pain and all the voices that had said it was impossible. They'd built a life. And standing there in the spring sunshine, surrounded by everything they'd fought for and everything they'd become, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.